Welcome to another episode of Husch Blackwell's False Claims Act Insights podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Porter. Managed care is a huge part of healthcare in America. I read somewhere that the majority of American healthcare dollars in some way flow through managed care. So for non-healthcare listeners, I know we got a bunch of those, managed care is when insurance manages costs by also managing the providers and the claims. So it's an integral part of the way healthcare works in America. Most might not think of managed care as having unique False Claims Act issues because they are paying claims to providers, but they actually do. And they have fairly interesting and unique issues within the False Claims Act world. The paying side has these big False Claims Act ramifications, including some that have been in the news lately. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about managed care and how managed care can have their own False Claims Act problems. Joining me to talk about the False Claims Act enforcement of managed care is my law partner, Tim Reiblin. Tim is a tremendous litigator. I like him a lot, but I don't know that I would like being on the other side of Tim on a case. In healthcare litigation, I don't know that there's someone better than Tim. What I like a lot about Husch Blackwell's healthcare team is that we've got all these people who know healthcare and know their practice area, and that's Tim. He's not just a top litigator, he knows healthcare. Tim even has a master's degree in medicinal chemistry. Tim, we'll talk about medicinal chemistry some other time, but good luck going up against that in court. And lucky for Husch Blackwell's healthcare clients, Tim is also skilled in litigating False Claims Act cases. In fact, Tim recently spoke at the American Conference Institute's Managed Care Conference about this exact issue, False Claims Act enforcement of managed care. And so that's what we're talking about today on the episode, taking advantage of Tim's hard work for that conference. So Tim, thanks for coming on the podcast and telling our listeners a little bit about False Claims Act enforcement in the managed care space.
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation to participate on the podcast. I guess you could say I'm a longtime listener, first-time caller. So looking forward to our discussion today.
That's excellent. So Tim, let's start with a zoomed out look of the False Claims Act. Tim, at the conference, you called 2025 a watershed year for False Claims Act enforcement. And I agree with you there, but I want to hear why you think it's a watershed year. What changed in 2025 and why should healthcare clients care?
Yeah, so I think as we look at the trends and the trajectories, the dollars were big, but the dollars are big every year. And that's in part or large part due to the government success and the power of the False Claims Act. But I think the reason when I'm thinking about 2025 and maybe a mindset shift or a paradigm shift is that the government appears to be utilizing more resources, more tools. So maybe they're relying less on the relators bar, but they still have the relators bar that are heavily impactful, but they're using additional tools, resources, and focus on the healthcare space, which as we've started to see and as we've seen going into 2026 with the number of cases that are being unsealed and filed, it's growing. And so while the False Claims Act has been a concern for our healthcare clients for years and many others in this space, I think it's not going away anytime soon. And what we're seeing from the current administration, from the DOJ, is a renewed and invigorated focus over all the tools that the government has available to it. The conference that I was at, the managed care conference, we had two high-level litigation attorneys from the DOJ and CMS. And it was interesting because amongst other things that they talked about, there was a comment made that if, and I'm sure I'm going to botch the numbers, but that if the government can basically stop $1 billion worth of fraud over the next couple of years, it extends the healthcare trust or the Medicare trust for multiples on end. So it's not a dollar for dollar savings. And that's how, based off the conference I went to and the comments I heard, I don't think the administration is looking at this as $1 of fraudulent conduct saved is $1 earned. Said it's multiplied over and over.
Yeah, those are excellent insights, Tim. And what's interesting, you talk about how DOJ is becoming less reliant on key TAMs. What's interesting to me is if you look at the numbers from last year, we had a record number of key TAMs as well. And so from what I'm seeing, the number of key TAMs are going up, but DOJ's ability to do things without key TAMs also going up, which to me says there's going to be a lot of enforcement in this space going forward. So sorry to our friends in the healthcare industry, but this is ramping up. Tim, I think what's also interesting, and you mentioned this to me, is at the conference, there was also talk about healthcare issues beyond what we think of as normal False Claims Act problems in the healthcare space. So what are some other common False Claims Act risks that our healthcare clients are facing beyond the sort of standard things that we think of?
Yeah, you bet. And this is, I think, is something we're seeing. I mean, the False Claims Act, it's known to live within the healthcare space, and research and reading about the False Claims Act. I mean, it did not start as a healthcare statute. It started about basically with government contractors, defense contractors during the Civil War. And what we are seeing, and I think what we'll continue to see, is a focus over not just healthcare, but other ways that the government can find a plausible theory, or a relator can find a plausible theory to find fraudulent conduct. And we're going to talk about this later, but the thing that gives me heartburn is the false certification cases. There's others, obviously, but the false certification, it can be a catch-all. And I think it's a catch-all that many people don't appreciate the impact of. The false certification cases are really coming to light amongst direct conduct, but also through false certification, are through False Claims Act related around tariffs, civil rights after the change in administration and the change in policy around DE&I, and cyber fraud. And these are problems that healthcare clients potentially have, maybe less so than tariffs than others, but pharmaceutical companies for sure. But these are problems that our clients will be having, but in their in-house counsel needs to think about, and their risk department needs to think about, not strictly billing, collecting money from the government, but also, are your cybersecurity practices up to snuff? What are you doing with respect to tariffs? Are they being misclassified, or is everything aligned with the current administration and what's being required? And then also, because of the change in administration and because of the focus and the policies around D&I, in-house counsel also need to make sure that their D&I practices are compliant to the extent that they are subject to the government's purview, and failure to do so under the current administration at least could result in some liability, including False Claims Act liability.
Yeah, Tim, great insights again. Yeah, I feel really bad for people in the healthcare world because they're getting hit on all sides. It feels like the False Claims Act's being used more than maybe what the Civil War era drafters of the False Claims Act, the original False Claims Act, might have thought about this, but this is the world we live in, so people have to be ready for it. So, Tim, all that background being established, let's talk about some managed care specific FCA issues now. So regular listeners have heard me say this 100 times. The False Claims Act is not for gray area disagreements or garden variety regulatory disputes. It's for people who try to knowingly defraud the government. What are the most common, how did this become a False Claims Act case type fact patterns you're seeing in Medicare Advantage? I assume risk adjustment is still front and center?
I would take a brief step back, because one thing I like to do is, on the payer side, there are strictly commercial agreements, and there's patients who have commercial insurance and they bill their insurance. That's not a False Claims Act. But where we see in the payer space, health insurance companies, if you will, start to find liability under the False Claims Act, particularly is in many areas, Medicare and Medicaid, but particularly for Medicare, it's with respect to Medicare Advantage, where the government has allowed private insurance companies to market a Medicare Advantage product, and the insurance company sets up a Medicare Advantage organization. And here it was set up to incentivize and utilize knowledge base and private business practices to see if private insurance companies or publicly traded insurance companies can administer Medicare in a way that makes it more economical, beneficial, or otherwise supported than the government can. However, once the private actors become government contractors, that's where we start to see the False Claims Act coming in, and a real eye towards the practices within the Medicare Advantage space. One thing to note is that for Medicare Advantage, more complicated, but for the ease of our conversation, basically, if I'm a Medicare Advantage enrollee, the government pays my insurance company a flat amount of dollars per month for me to have Medicare Advantage. And then it's up to my insurance company, if they want to make profit off of me, to manage my care in a way that aligns with the care that I am allowed to receive, but without giving me more care and costing more money than I would otherwise be entitled to. And apologies for the long kind of explanation there, but that's where risk adjustment comes into play, because the sicker the patient, the less money. It's an easy calculation. The sicker the patient, the more resources obviously they're going to be the higher premiums, but that's not really as applicable in the Medicare Advantage space. So really, what insurance companies, the more profitable patients under the Medicare Advantage space, are your healthier patients. And so this is where risk adjustments come in. And is the insurance company upcoding or downcoding the patient such that the claims and the reimbursement for the insurance companies match the actual patient's level of care? Or are they being upcoded to reflect that they're sicker so that the government pays more to the managed care organization? Or are they being downcoded so that the managed care organization can provide less care? A couple of just the common issues that we're seeing, these ad-only or these one-way retrospective reviews where it's more or less an after-the-fact billing practices to see what else could have been done. And basically, another example is these templates, which, if used by the clinicians, really kind of steer their medical judgment in one way or the other. But one way that it would result in a potentially False Claims Act claim is if you're steering a provider towards a higher paying diagnosis such that the insurance company can claim more dollars for this patient. And again, it's coding and it's upcoding and it's all of the things that you could do to make somebody appear on a claim by claim basis or on paper sicker than they are so you can justify recouping higher dollars for managing their care.
Thanks, Tim. That's a really in the weeds issue. It took my tiny brain a long time to try to figure out what exactly is the False Claims Act hook with the one-way look issue in managed care. But you did a good job explaining it. Like you said, if you got patients who are sicker on paper, you get more money. And that's why managed care plans do that. And that's why they engage in these chart reviews, is to try to find that. But you pinpointed the problem. If you're going to look at these chart reviews and just find things that increase the payments and you conveniently ignore the things that would give you less money, DOJ's got a problem with that. And there's been a lot of big settlements in that space. So Tim, excellent analysis there. So at the conference, I think you also highlighted sales and marketing practices is something that could create anti-kickback statute scrutiny. You know that I love anti-kickback statutes because there's a lot that goes into that. It's a broad statute, but not broadly enforced, and yet is capable of being broadly enforced if DOJ really wants to. So in the managed care space, what should managed care folks know about broker and enrollment related theories right now?
Oh, yeah. No, this is a hot topic. To your point, the AKS is a powerful enforcement tool. I think is less powerfully or less often utilized in the FCA space, but I think that's changing. And I think we will see it changing. And I think it's a real crossover of criminal and civil liability. So, yeah, as I think about the broker space, I mean, these managed care organizations will hire brokers, marketing companies, individuals to help them fill their patient base. And as with many things, this is supposed to be the broker's job, I think, has good intentions to where they are supposed to help find the right people, find the specific managed care or MAO that would work best for them based off the plan offering, et cetera. And they're to help sell the product, if you will, and find enrollees. However, where brokers, managed care organizations, and even providers get in trouble under the AKS and under the False Claims Act, it's when the brokers start influencing the patient base and their enrollment. And that's a case that's been out for a while. And I think the allegations, I mean, I'll just touch on them briefly, but the brokers were unbiased stewards. And how were they unbiased stewards? Is that the brokers were incentivized to enroll certain patients, like I mentioned earlier, enroll healthier patients who utilize less resources, set up their websites, or otherwise are disincentivized by enrolling sicker patients or disabled patients who may use more resources but don't have as high a reimbursement, and otherwise using these brokers to get into arrangements outside of the strict, you are here to help market plans, and influencing one plan over the other. This is far-reaching because what is the allegations in lawsuits of this nature have focused both on the managed care organizations, the broker companies, the marketing arrangements, but also on healthcare providers who have relationships with certain brokers and will work with the brokers to help steer certain patients to certain arrangements, and in return opens up the potential that the brokers are paying kickbacks or otherwise incentivizing physicians, which would result in referrals, remuneration, and as you can imagine, all things that are impacted by the AKS.
Thanks, Tim. And speaking of legislative history, you talked about the origins of the False Claims Act. The Anti-Kickback Statute has its own very interesting origin story, which we should probably go into sometime. I'm fascinated. I'm probably one of the few people who's dug in and read the legislative history on it. No one else is that much of a nerd, but I am.
Well, I would say, John, that I know it. In talking about it, I think it would make a fascinating backstory in understanding the AKS, because its origin story is, not to give too much away now, but certainly something that's got a bit of lore to it in how it came about.
Yeah. All right. So you just heard Tim agree to do the part 2 of the podcast where we're going to do origin story, Anti-Kickback Statute version. All right. So speaking of the Anti-Kickback Statute, a lot of people assume that these are easy to plead. A lot of people say, okay, well, yeah, if you paid kickbacks, you gave something of value in exchange for some referral source, then that must be easy to plead. But it's not. Your slide deck for your presentation had a whole slide on AKS causation. That's a huge, huge issue in FCA enforcement right now. Tim, what does that debate mean in real life for managed care cases?
Yeah. And I think the defense attorney's playbook is in any FCA case. I mean, you're going to be pleading, 12B6 at a minimum and 12B8 and 12B9. So you're going to scrutinize the pleadings, and many of these cases will go through several rounds of pleading, motions to dismiss, amendments, etc. But there's a debate right now. There's a circuit split, and it's over AKS causation. And in 2010, Congress amended the AKS largely in response to a district court in Arkansas in a False Claims Act case, which found that the hospital could not be liable under the False Claims Act for the physician's improper conduct with a medical device supplier. So looking at this, and not to get too far in the weeds, but basically what was alleged was doctors had set up an improper payment arrangement with the device supplier, but because the doctors were performing the surgeries at this hospital and the hospital was getting paid a fee for the physicians doing the surgeries at this hospital, then under the False Claims Act and under the AKS, the hospital must also be liable for the conduct. And even though, according to the case, there was no evidence, and the district court found that there was no evidence connecting the hospital with the alleged culpable conduct on behalf of the physicians and the medical device supplier. So Congress responded and said, we don't agree with this interpretation, and we're going to adjust the language. And they added the language, which is 2 words. As often in the False Claims Act, many issues turn on the use of 2 to 3 words. But this one, they added language which now reads, a claim that includes item or services resulting from a violation of the AKS constitutes a false or fraudulent claim. So what is resulting from? Is it but-for causation? Is it something else? It's been a point of debate, and it will continue to be a point of debate for a while. We currently have a circuit split where the majority view is more on the defensive side, if you will, and it says resulting from means but for causation. This is a higher hurdle for the DOJ and Relators Counsel. So the DOJ says this complicates the litigation, requires extensive efforts to disentangle the motivations of treating physicians for every treatment decision or referral at issue. So I see the point, but at the end of the day, in a False Claims Act case is a claim-by-claim basis. In my unbiased or very biased, I guess, opinion, the majority view is the correct view, because if you're going to allege each claim is a fraudulent act giving liability under the False Claims Act, then you need to prove that there is culpable conduct associated with each act and flowing from there. The minority view is the relator, and it's the more government-friendly side, which is it allows you to plead alternative pathways if you're not able to plead the AKS causation, the but-for standard. So you can look at these alternative theories, such as the false certification theory, which are a lower standard and make the barrier to entry, if you will, for a relator or for the DOJ much lower when they're pleading a case.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I'm super fascinated by this issue. There's not a lot of us, but hey, if we're nerding out on stuff, this is a thing to nerd out on. In defense of the government's point, there's nothing in the legislative history that says that Congress was trying to mess with how this worked. I give them that. But on our side, words have meaning. And these words, it's the barrage case that the Supreme Court said that resulting from means but for causation. you can't just sort of pick and choose when words have particular meanings. So to me, this is a pretty easy thing for courts to get right. And my bigger point in all this is if Congress really didn't mean to do this, they can change the law, change 2 words. It's really not that complicated. Congress hasn't done that. It's been a long time since the Affordable Care Act did this. So if Congress has such a big problem with the way the case law is coming out, they're welcome to change the law, but they haven't. So that's where we are.
And I think absent that, I think we'll hear about it from the Supreme Court one day. I mean, to your point earlier, the AKS cases are much smaller in size than other False Claims Act cases. So I don't know that it's going to be a high priority for the Supremes to take up, but I fully expect absent Congress stepping in and changing something or one of the circuits or all the circuits completely flipping their position. I think we'll get there. And I think it'll be an interesting decision because depending on how the Supremes come out, it could create some conflict over statutory construction within 2 different statutes, but using the same words.
Yeah, Tim, what you're teeing up here is, I guess, part 3 of the podcast for us, where we're going to go into all the different things that should be going up to the Supreme Court right now. A circuit split like that is pretty hard to reconcile without the Supremes taking that up. So that's one. There's a bunch of other stuff. So yeah, you're exactly right. I think the False Claims Act could be revisited and revised a lot. This could look very different in 5 years. I think that's fair to say. Speaking of things looking very different in 5 years, AI. So in healthcare now, AI is letting organizations track things that we haven't been able to track before. And that has an important tie-in with FCA enforcement. I did a whole podcast episode with my friend Andy Sobchak of the Coker Group on this, but it's continuing to be a big thing, AI in healthcare. At the conference, you discussed how seemingly routine marketing analytics can become evidence. I think that's a really important point for people to understand. What's the practice lesson from the ROI tracking examples that you highlighted? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So any good company, right, is going to track metrics. And to your point, AI and higher computing power has allowed us to track different metrics and process more data on a quick fashion. Be careful over the ROI calculus because in the healthcare space, particularly in the AKS space, the nexus is, did you do something that caused a referral that you would have not otherwise received the referral, but for taking some action? I've conflated several terms there, but it was on purpose to try to describe the way that I see the AKS, which is, did you do something that gave you more patients and more money than you otherwise would have had if you would have not done that? And the ROI is, and this is where we're seeing it, is physician speaker programs. And there's many rules around, particularly pharmaceutical companies who can incentivize speakers or medical device speakers and the trainings they can provide them and whatnot. But where we're starting to see problems come up is where companies are tracking ROIs for a specific presenter or presenters and tracking their what is an allowed practice, which is you're allowed to pay them consulting fees and speaking fees and whatnot. And then are you getting more referrals or are you making more money or are you selling more product through those physicians that you have these arrangements with? And that's where classic example is Dr. Porter gives us a presentation and Dr. Porter was using our medical device for 10% of his patients. And now Dr. Porter is using it for 90% of his patients. Tracking that ROI gives a insight into is Dr. Porter's switch in his referrals. Is it due to the fact that Dr. Porter likes this device better, or is it the fact that Dr. Porter feels as though he's ingratiated to this company and he needs to sell their product for them? That's a classic example, and that's where the AKS lives, eats, and dies really under this nexus. And you really have to be careful about ensuring that this isn't happening, but how do you do that while you're tracking your ROI, but also ensuring that you're not going too far or that it's happening in a way that could implicate you?
Yeah, Tim, and that's the big tension in all of this is we're talking about businesses, or even if we're not talking about businesses, if we're talking about nonprofits, they've got to keep the lights on. In order to keep the lights on, you got to know whether you're spending your money in a reasonable way. And so tracking return on investment makes total sense for everyone. And yet it's hard to say that something's not of value if you're trying to track the value of it. I get it. That's why this is sort of a hard thing for me to square with how we normally think about the False Claims Act. It's a really, really, really big topic. And it's, like you said, it's only going to get bigger. So another topic that's big in both managed care and the healthcare industry in general is parent or successor liability. So how can corporate parents, PE sponsors, or acquirers end up in an FCA case involving a managed care business line. This happens. So tell our listeners about that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would say as an associate at Husch Blackwell, one of the first real teethy False Claims Act case I worked on actually involved some parent successor liability. And I found it to be fascinating that ostensibly the new company was spending a lot of time and effort answering questions about conduct that happened in a prior acquisition and was having to defend against a case and conduct that they had not started or were participating in. But nevertheless, the liability was still there. Look, this comes about because in the healthcare space over the past couple decades, and particularly over the past couple of years, consolidation. And I mean, healthcare companies, many of whom who've grown bigger, purchasing up their competition and consolidating to expand their offerings. But you don't know what you don't know. And are you in a transaction where everybody wants to get a deal done? What problems are you buying when you bring them in? And the government is, in looking at this, I mean, there's ways to address it on the deal side, and that's something we talked about at our conference. But there's also, what is the government looking at? Because ignorance of something is not a defense, particularly in the FCA space. But the government is taking a hard stance over to the parent or the controlling entities for prior conduct. What did you know? Did this conduct stop when they became part of your organization? Or did you allow this conduct to continue knowingly or unknowingly in a way that you could have or should have stepped in and stopped it, but you didn't? And cases about this, and I think we're going to see it more and more as the government goes and keeps looking and they start to look at older companies or consolidated companies, and just a company being sold does not absolve it of its liability, particularly with the length of statute limitations under the False Claims Act cases. You can see these problems or a company's prior problems from years before creep up over and over again.
Thanks, Tim. I won't make you give the year that you dug into that issue back when you were an associate. You and I are getting older now, and so let's not go down that trail. But since that research, Tim, I know this has become a bigger and bigger issue. So glad you were on the cutting edge of that. It continues to be a big deal. So, Tim, last question. Looking ahead, you flagged DOJ's increased use of data analytics and AI. How does that change the detection side of managed care FCA enforcement? And what should the industry do about it now?
Yeah, and this feeds in nicely with our last topic, but the government has had tools. It's had some relatively good tools, if you will, to identify trends. And that's what a lot of the DOJ has been doing, is in ferreting out fraud and is looking at trends. Is there a trend here? But a trend does not make a False Claims Act case. It's about identifying a trend, finding information, whether it be people or through a CID or otherwise, and taking that information and turning it into, do you have a claim, and then a pleading if you do. So as with everything, the government is using AI, just like many in private practice are. But with AI, what has been I think is going to be an increasing shift is AI has changed resource allocation. One of the avenues that many defense counsel have used, including myself, when responding to a CID in years past, is working with the requesting attorney on the government side to narrow the scope because of limited resources on the government side to process review data. Now, under the new regime, I think those negotiations for narrowing the scope of CID responses are going to be less, because I think the government attorneys have fancier, better tools and more resources at their availability to be able to process large amounts of data. So I would be willing to bet that as we see this grow, the DOJ is going to say, I asked for everything. I want everything. I think I'm entitled to everything. Give me everything. And if it's too much data, I'll deal with it. But I can deal with a lot more data now than if I have reviewers or using less sophisticated tools and equipment. On top of that, I think AI can do more than just review data. And here's where I think it's going to come in is there are AI companies that are coming up and they're selling coding specific AI tools for the managed care space. And these tools, I think, to the extent that they can do this, and I've seen some examples, I think that they can, where they're taking logic, right? Is this a claim? Is this a patient? Was there risk adjustment? Was this required? They're looking at the actual coding in a way that I think is a deeper dive than what the tools have allowed us to do in the past, which was, generically speaking, does Dr. Porter code this one type of claim more than other providers in his area? If so, why? Now I think it can do a deeper dive on faster and will help make decisions over, is this something we have to go look at? Again, we know there's an emphasis for more enforcement. There's a trend where DOJ is doing its own cases. It's not relying extensively or as much on the relators bar, even though the relators bar is still very active. And I think these AI tools, to the extent that they can create tangible, confirmable, repeatable results, I think is another very powerful toolkit in the government's pocket.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Tim. The way that DOJ is using new data, I think they have a similar expectation for managed care, is that managed care is going to use data to do things that are going to save dollars. And so I think you made all the right points, Tim. It's really good to have you on the podcast to hear your takes on this. And I'm grateful that you spoke at the American Conference Institute about that. But I'm glad that our listeners also get the benefit of your wisdom here. So, Tim, thanks for coming on the podcast and telling our listeners about this important topic.
No, thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to more podcasts and more topics to nerd out with you on.
Yeah, absolutely. So to close, as you heard, Tim committed to 2 more podcasts. So you've got to subscribe, however you listen to this, subscribe to this so that you don't miss Tim's follow-up episodes where we're going to dig into the history of the Anti-Kickback Statute. It actually is a really interesting history point. So we might do just a little history lesson as a follow-up episode, because I think it's important to know why we're doing the things that we're doing. To me, the reason that our listeners hear me talk about the False Claims Act origins in the Civil War is because I think it's important to know what this was trying to do at the beginning and how far we've come from the bare bones, here's the type of thing that we were trying to stop back then situation. So we're going to continue to bring you stuff like this. We're going to continue to think about the False Claims Act. Like Tim said, this is only going to be a bigger and bigger deal. And so to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.